I'm Dr. Nathaniel Chin, and you're listening to Dementia Matters, a podcast about Alzheimer's disease. Dementia Matters is a production of the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Our goal is to educate listeners on the latest news in Alzheimer's disease research and caregiver strategies. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Dementia Matters. As the new year begins, people are starting to think of resolutions. Some will start prioritizing their sleep more, some will try to spend more time with loved ones, and others will focus on exercise and physical activity. As we've seen in previous episodes, good sleep and socialization can both be helpful in reducing Alzheimer's risk, but today we'll be talking about the exercise side of things, specifically getting your steps in. A new study led by researchers at Harvard Medical School and Mass General Brigham has come out showing that getting 5,000 steps a day could slow cognitive decline in people with signs of Alzheimer's disease. Joining me to discuss this exciting research are Dr. Breidenbach and Sarah Lowe's. Dr. Breidenbach is a scientist in the Okonkwo Laboratory here at UW-Madison, as well as an exercise physiologist with extensive experience in cardiopulmonary exercise testing. Her research focuses on identifying cardiometabolic and vascular factors that promote brain resilience in aging. Sarah Lowe's is a returning guest on the podcast and serves as the research program manager in the Okonkwo Laboratory. She oversees a large research portfolio focusing on both modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors linked to cognitive resilience in Alzheimer's disease, including physical activity and cardiorespiratory fitness. She's also an exercise physiologist, conducting maximal graded exercise testing in older research participants and processing accelerometry research data. Bree and Sarah, welcome to Dementia Matters.
Thank you for having us.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Nate.
So in this Nature Medicine study, it's called Physical Activity as a Modifiable Risk Factor in Preclinical Alzheimer's Disease. These investigators from the Harvard Aging Brain Study looked at almost 300 cognitively unimpaired older adults to see the relationship between physical activity and sort of cognitive ability. And they did this for a pretty extended period of time. And they focused on people who had elevated amyloid at their baseline. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to steal your thunder, and I really want you, as the experts, to be able to tell us what you liked, didn't like, perhaps, or what you think about when you read such an important publication, and then what we could apply in the everyday world. So, Bree, I'm going to start with you. And so for our listeners, what exactly was the study looking at?
Yeah, so scientists were investigating the potential protective relationship of physical activity on both cognitive function as well as maybe getting at some of the underlying mechanisms that may provide protection to cognitive function. What they found were that in individuals with high levels of beta amyloid, a key biological hallmark of AD, cognition and function declined more slowly if they were physically active. Specifically, low to moderate physical activity was found to slow cognitive decline by about half compared to inactive individuals. Now, this protective effect was found to plateau at about 5 to 7.5 thousand steps a day. So now getting at the underlying mechanisms, or maybe looking at some of the underlying mechanisms. Physical activity did not slow the buildup of amyloid. Our lab and several others have found similar results when examining the protective effect of physical activity or cardiorespiratory fitness in relation to amyloid presence and preserved cognitive function. Instead, what they did find was that physical activity was linked to slower buildup of tau, which is the other key biological hallmark of AD.
So, Bree, this is really exciting because, as we have shown here in Wisconsin, I say we, but I mean you and the team, that physical activity does not impact the accumulation of amyloid once you're already elevated. And of course, that's not a finding we like, but that's the reality of the situation as we see it. But it does seem to show that perhaps there's this impact on tau protein. And from a humanistic standpoint, that's the protein we really care about because that's the one that's linked to decline and symptoms. And so when you see this, is this a brand new finding, or is this just more evidence for something that other studies have also showed in the past?
I believe that a few studies may have found similar results. However, I think that the majority are not able to look at tau closely enough. The majority of studies are either focused solely on amyloid or they're looking at amyloid and tau in individuals who are not amyloid positive. And so, what we know about the neuropathological cascade is that amyloid presents 10 to 20 years prior to clinical symptoms. And then later on in that trajectory, tau then shows up. So, I think a strength of this study was that it really focused on individuals who are already amyloid positive. So, we were able to see that variation in tau.
And I've asked this question of Sarah in our prior episodes. So I'd like to ask you now, how do you differentiate physical activity from exercise? Like when your relatives at a holiday party ask you the difference, what do you tell them?
Yeah, so physical activity is a broad umbrella term. It's any bodily movement that results in energy expenditure, and it occurs across multiple domains of life, like leisure, occupation, transportation, household tasks. Examples like walking to work, gardening, yard work, cleaning your house, or walking the dog. Well, exercise is a subtype of physical activity, so it's structured, planned, repetitive, and purposeful. Examples are walking, running, cycling, resistance training, yoga, so on.
What I think is interesting about your answer, other than it was very eerily similar to Sarah's from years ago, is that walking's in both categories. And so we're going to go into that in more detail with this conversation because I think this is really what we're getting at. Walking is something that many people can do, but some it's activity and others it might actually be exercise. And so, Sarah, this study used objective step counts, so not a self report. And why does that distinction matter? And how is it different to other studies looking at physical activity and cognition, Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a very important thing that they're using an objective step count. That essentially means that there is no self-bias from the participant. They themselves aren't reporting it. So it's just measuring whatever is actually happening in terms of steps. And that's important because people are really bad at estimating how much activity that they do. We think that we're good at it, but the reality is that we're not. And especially when it comes to something like step counts, that's really hard to estimate how many steps you've taken. And so in terms of other studies and looking at physical activity, some will use pedometers, some will use self-report things such as questionnaires just because they're really feasible and easy to get from a lot of people. So if you want a larger sample size, that is something that people will use. And then there's also other objective measures like actigraphy, which is something we use in our lab, very similar to a pedometer, but instead of just counting steps, it's counting the intensity of movement as well, which is really important. And you kind of touched on, and I'm sure we'll talk about a lot today. And so, regardless, they'll sometimes look at it as a continuum measurement, or they'll break it into categories like low activity, medium activity, high activity. And in this study, they categorized it in that low, moderate, and high activity levels.
And so, what are the strengths or weaknesses of a 7-day waistband pedometer snapshot like that was done in this study? And what kinds of things are we missing when we look at just a pedometer reading?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what's good about a 7-day reading is that you're averaging out someone's activity. If we just looked at one day, that could be highly variable in the amount of activity that they're doing. So by doing it across 7 days, you get a better snapshot. So that is good. Again, being an objective measure is great. It's low demand, inexpensive. People have ways to count their steps, even without it being provided by like a research team. It's really easy for people to relate to as well. But on the other side, in this study, it was just one 7-day snapshot. So it didn't look over time, and people's activity can change over time, and weeks can change depending on weather, the time of year, what activities are you doing are you on vacation, or are you not? Things like that. Our activities are really variable. So that is a limitation with any active measurement of physical activity that we do. But I think the biggest thing about this study and the pedometer, which I've kind of touched on, is that lack of intensity measurement, and things like an accelerometer can do that. So we don't know how intense these steps were. We don't know the duration that people were walking and, being physically active throughout the day. So that is a weakness of just using a step count.
One of the key headlines that came out of this, not from the researchers, but just from the media, is you don't need 10,000 steps. Of course, I'm a little bit worried about such a statement. And so, what did the dose response curve actually show?
So the results demonstrated substantially slower rates of tau accumulation and cognitive and functional decline across low, moderate, and active groups. Moderate and high activity seem to have similar results, which is where this plateau in the dose response curve comes into play. So, in research, a plateau is going to refer to the point at which increasing the dose, in this case physical activity, no longer produces additional meaningful changes in the outcome. Specifically, they found protective effects of physical activity leveled off at about 5 to 7,500 steps per day, which is where this headline is coming from. Cognitive decline was lower by 40%, 54, and 51% across increasing physical activity levels, going from low, moderate to active. Thresholds of cognitive worsening were estimated at 6.5 years for inactive versus 9.6, 13.6, and 12.7 years going from baseline cognitive impairment. So going from inactive, low, moderate, and then active. Similarly, there were 34%, 45%, and 51% slower functional decline across in those increasing activity levels.
These are pretty impressive numbers, Bree.
Yeah, I do think that they are promising, but Nate, as you mentioned, like you're slightly concerned about this headline, right? Whether it's is 5,000 the new 10,000. And I do think so. If we refer back to a paper published a few years ago by Del Pozo Cruz, he found a similar dose response effect of steps, but there were some key differences. So they found that as little as 3,800 steps were found to reduce dementia risk by 25%, but that 9,800 steps, so almost at 10,000 steps, reduced the risk by 50%. Now, the big difference, they also found that the intensity of those steps mattered. So they used an accelerometer compared to the pedometer that Sarah was just discussing. They found that there was a 57% risk reduction at 6,300 steps, where steps occurred at more than 40 per minute. And furthermore, a 62% reduction when walking at 112 steps per minute. So I do think that, in comparison to the current study, the use of this accelerometer is what allowed them to capture the continued risk reduction with increasing steps and intensity.
I'm really glad you clarified that because, and we've been hinting at intensity matters. When I read it, one of the things I kept thinking about was, well, it's a certain outcome that you're looking at. And you use the word outcome too, but this study was only looking at that one. There are other studies that might look at different outcomes like cardiovascular mortality or some other factor. And in that regard, perhaps it does take 10,000 steps to reach that outcome. And so, just for our listeners, we always have to be very careful about what they're looking at because they can only speak to what they were specifically looking at, and they can't speak to the other things that might matter to us. And so, I would I would never discourage anyone from walking more than 7,500 steps if they want to. In fact, I still think walking more is going to be better. And I get the sense that that's what you're saying too.
Yes, definitely. Actually, the plateau, I'm glad you started to bring this up. A plateau may also just simply mean the metric or the step count stops capturing meaningful variation. So, meaning it does not, well, we already discussed this, it doesn't capture the intensity of steps or the duration of the continuous bouts of exercise, but it can't measure cardiorespiratory fitness, also known as your VO2 max, or your muscular strength or endurance. So there's likely going to be differences in cardiorespiratory fitness and muscular strength in those who achieve 5,000 steps versus 10,000 steps. And the pedometer is not capturing those differences.
Another key point was that activity wasn't linked to lower amyloid over time, but it was linked to that slower tau accumulation. And Bree did a nice job of explaining that. Why is that such a big deal, not only for the field, but you think just for the field of exercise and cognition, but also just the larger Alzheimer's disease and related dementia field?
So, the disease unfolds over a prolonged biological timeline in which amyloid accumulation begins early and often plateaus, and then tau pathology emerges later, spreads regionally throughout the brain, and then is closely followed by neurodegeneration and measurable cognitive decline. So, the fact that activity was linked to slower tau accumulation indicates physical activity as modifying disease expression, but perhaps not disease initiation. And while I know I'm speculating here, it may indicate that activity could reduce neuronal vulnerability to tau pathology. It could maybe slow transsynaptic spread of tau, or maybe even preserve synaptic integrity in the presence of tau.
I think one of the exciting things about this, though, is for people who have amyloid in their brain, particularly those preclinical, so those without impairments yet, which is what the study looked at. There's a motivator here, or motivational factor, I should say, as far as if you are moving, if you're ideally exercising, but walking a certain number of steps, perhaps you really are impacting the accumulation of this major protein that affects your brain's health as well as cognition and symptoms. So I think, I don't want to put too much emphasis into this, but I think it does seem to be a positive finding. And this paper is also arguing that slower tau accumulation mediated this association between activity and slower cognitive decline. So that's what I'm hinting at. But how convincing is that mediation story? And what are some limitations in a study like this? How would you sort of ask me to calm down from my excitement based on the work that you do?
So, first, let's talk about what a mediation analysis is. And I'm going to keep it simple, but it's a statistical framework used to ask a very specific question about how an association works. So, in other words, instead of asking, is physical activity associated with cognitive function? A mediation asks, through what mechanisms does physical activity influence cognitive function? And so it is important to note like what a mediation does not do. It does not prove causality. It simply quantifies how much of an association between physical activity and cognition or function operates through that mediator, which in our case is tau. I do think that the results are promising. You know, it confirms a potential pathway, or it confirms a hypothesis that changes in tau are then going to affect cognition. There is one large issue I see with it. So, every statistical test has a set of rules you have to abide by during application. And for a mediation, one of those rules is a temporal ordering, meaning that your events occur in a very specific time sequence. So, physical activity affects tau, and then tau affects cognition in that order. However, the authors did address this in the paper, we know that cognitive impairment can also affect activity level. And so, therefore, it violates one of the rules or the assumptions of mediation. But I do still think these results are promising. We just need to interpret that carefully.
I appreciate you tempering my enthusiasm, Bree. Now, if someone who's listening is sedentary and they're worried about their Alzheimer's risk, what would an evidence aligned sort of starter plan look like if you were to incorporate this particular publication too?
Yeah, well, I can answer that. First, you always need to consult with your primary care provider. I don't feel like I need to say that, but I do. I want to be doing my due diligence if I didn't, and especially if you're starting from sedentary, everyone's is different, and so they need to make sure that they're going to do the exercise safely. So that's the first step. Outside of that, the key is really to just get moving. And the best way to do that is to find whatever activity it is that you enjoy and so that you're going to want to keep doing, because consistency and keeping up with the activity is actually what's going to be key to receiving these benefits. Ideally, you're going to pick an activity that gets your heart rate up. So this study talked about walking. That's a very easy choice. Just start with walking. But, walking's not necessarily enjoyable for everybody. Some people find it a little boring. So you can try to mix it up in whatever way works for you. But ultimately, start small, ideally in 10-minute bouts, and then progressing from there. And progression can mean a lot of different things as well. So progression can mean increasing the duration that you're walking. So starting with 10 minutes, and then maybe the next week you do 15 minutes, or you then do 10 minutes at 2 different times of the day, right? So increasing that duration. Or if you, instead of want to focus on the steps itself, just adding more steps, right, to each time that you do an exercise bout. But also progression can come in the form of intensity. I know I keep harping on it, but intensity is really important. And so you can increase intensity by obviously increasing the speed at which you're walking, but you could also do things like adding an incline, like hills. That's going to increase the intensity of a walking workout as well.
I'm glad you brought up intensity again, Sarah. Because I think what we're getting at here is steps are a proxy for movement or physical activity, doesn't cover intensity. But in the end, like when you're thinking about it from a general public perspective, maybe we don't have the evidence for this, but what do we think matters the most? Obviously, all three matter, but volume, intensity, or consistency. Like if we had to put more emphasis on one over the other, based on the research, based on what you have seen, what do you think? Well, how would you rank those?
Oh man, I don't know if I can rank them because they all three are really important. It truly is a combination of the three of them. They all interplay with one another. As you increase your intensity, you can only increase your duration so much until you progress, right? So they're all interconnected, but if I had to, I would probably put consistency first, followed by intensity and then volume. And the reason for that is you can't just do an exercise once and be like, hey, I got benefits. I'm done. I don't need to do this again. Like, that's just not how it works. A lot of times, these changes take time. So it could be 6 months of continuous, consistent exercise until you actually obtain some of these benefits. But then you also have to maintain the benefits. They could go away, if you go back to, say, a sedentary lifestyle. So consistency is key for sure. And then intensity is really important. And our work has shown that as well, that really getting at least that moderate intensity exercise is what's needed to see the brain health benefits. So low intensity steps versus moderate intensity steps, there is a difference there when it does come to benefits.
I wasn't sure you were going to actually give me an answer, so thank you, Sarah, um, and putting your chips down. For our listeners, though, a pedometer is not going to give you intensity. It sounds like perhaps certain devices, like actigraphy, could do that. But how should a person think, or how could we measure, even crudely, intensity as we're walking or jogging?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, intensity is simply how hard are you working? The harder you feel like you're working, the more intense that you're working. And a lot of times that can come down to two things, your heart rate and your breathing. So, something that is really simple for people to use is something we call the talk test. It uses both your breathing and your ability to talk as a marker of intensity. So if your breathing feels light and you can speak normally or sing, you're working at a light intensity. If your breathing's heavier and you can talk but you can't sing, then you're working at a moderate intensity. And then if you're breathing very heavily, you can only say a few words at a time, then you're working at that vigorous intensity. So you don't need any fancy gadgets. You just are really focusing in on your body and the breathing, your ability to talk, and then also just, measuring your heart rate. If your heart rate is higher, you're working more intensely.
Those are great tips, and I appreciate you enacting that for us too. What about people who can't rack up the steps because of arthritis, neuropathy, some form of disability, or they just prefer a different type of activity that might be strength based? What would you say to them based on how you interpret this particular study?
Yeah, again, find what you enjoy doing and do that. It's really about getting moving, right? This study is using steps as a proxy for physical activity, but ultimately it is the act of physical activity itself, not necessarily that they're taking steps, it's that they're being physically active. That's what's likely causing, these changes. And so find whatever it is that you enjoy doing and do it consistently. And so this could be things like swimming or cycling, resistance training, really anything that's going to get your heart rate up. And depending on, if you have something like you said, arthritis or, a disability or anything, again, that's where when you talk with your primary care provider, they're going to help work with you on activities that would work for your situation. But ultimately, whatever you choose, you can also just follow the well-established physical activity recommendations. 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, or 75 minutes a week of vigorous intensity aerobic exercise. When doing that, minimum of 10-minute bouts. And then if you also are inclined to do muscles strengthening activities, you should do those 2 days a week, because research has found that those guidelines, though they weren't meant for brain health, they do actually impact brain health as well. The heart and brain are connected, so whatever's good for the heart is most likely going to also be good for your brain.
I'm glad you mentioned the 2 times a week of strength based, because as a geriatrician that focuses on function and disability, it really is the combination. Like so many things in life, right? It's moderation and combination. And I've been saying more and more to my patients, I really do want aerobic exercise, but I also want you to maintain or build skeletal muscle, so strength based. And I would like you to do the third one of balance and sort of stretching yoga so that you don't fall. And so it's multiple components, which also just gives us more options. So we don't have to be excellent at everything. We can just sort of build into our repertoire different activities so that we don't get bored either.
Are you familiar with functional resistance training?
No. What is functional resistance training?
Functional resistance training is focused on strengthening muscles in functional movement patterns. So things like picking up a laundry basket and then stepping over. So it's all resistance training, but it's really geared towards movements that we use in everyday life, and it's particularly helpful for older populations for that reason.
I think that's really great. Maybe we'll have a future episode with an expert on functional resistance training. So I'm going to end our conversation today by asking more about research. And so if you were designing the next trial, what would you test and how would you measure success?
Personally, I would like to do a clinical trial that combines exercise with the anti-amyloid therapies. I think all fitness levels, whether you're sedentary or active, are welcome. But I think it would be spectacular to combine therapies that target amyloid as well as tau, which is what this study showed that physical activity will likely has a relationship with. So targeting both amyloid and tau at the same time. As far as endpoints, I think cognition and function are the most clinically meaningful. But as a researcher, I would also be very interested to see amyloid and tau, because we do care about those and how they progress with interventions as well.
Well, I want to thank the two of you for being on this podcast and helping explain for our audience this important publication, its meaning for those of us in research and for those of us just out in the public who are always wanting to keep our brain as healthy as possible. So thank you again.
Thank you again for having us. Always happy to have these conversations.
Thank you for listening to Dementia Matters. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, or tell your smart speaker to play the Dementia Matters podcast. Please rate us on your favorite podcast app. It helps other people find our show and lets us know how we're doing. If you enjoy our show and want to support our work, consider making a gift to the Dementia Matters Fund through the UW Initiative to End Alzheimer's. All donations go toward outreach and production. Donate at the link in the description. Dementia Matters is brought to you by the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It receives funding from private, university, state, and national sources, including a grant from the National Institutes on Aging for Alzheimer's Disease Research. This episode of Dementia Matters was produced by Kaylin Rowerdink and edited by Eli Gadbury. Our musical jingle is Cases to Rest by Blue Dot Sessions. To learn more about the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, check out our website at adrc.wisc.edu. That's adrc.wisc.edu. And follow us on Facebook and Twitter. If you have any questions or comments, email us at dementiamatters@medicine.wisc.edu. Thanks for listening.